Stepping off a westbound train, a hopeful mail-order bride expected a wealthy rancher and a dream life. Instead, a decaying cabin, a loaded shotgun pointed at her chest, and 7 starving children awaited. Her groom had vanished completely. Her next choice forged a wild, unforgettable frontier legend. In the forgotten archives of the Colorado Territory, dated September of 1878, lies the remarkable true account of Beatrice Colton. A woman of gentle upbringing from Philadelphia, Beatrice had lost everything her parents to the cholera epidemic and her meager inheritance to a deceitful uncle. Left with nothing but a few silk dresses and a heart desperate for security, she answered an advertisement in the Times Matrimonial News. The letters she received in return were eloquently written, penned by a man named Hiram Gallagher. He wrote of a sprawling, prosperous cattle empire near the town of Mercer's Crossing, Colorado. He spoke of rolling green pastures, a grand 2-story homestead with a wraparound porch, and a life of quiet, respectable abundance. He needed a wife to manage his grand estate. Beatrice, longing for a home, accepted his proposal by mail. She arrived in Mercer's Crossing on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, dressed in her finest traveling gown, her grandmother's pearl brooch pinned to her collar. The town was not the thriving settlement Hiram had described. It was a brutal, wind-scoured collection of unpainted timber buildings, saloons, and a single mercantile clinging to the edge of a jagged canyon. When Beatrice hired a cynical, tobacco-chewing stagecoach driver named Amos Tucker to take her to the Gallagher estate, the old man simply spat into the dust and gave her a look of profound pity. "You sure about this, ma'am?" Amos had asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. Hiram Gallagher ain't exactly what you'd call a grand estate kind of man. Beatrice insisted, clutching her carpetbag. The ride out of town took 2 grueling hours over bone-rattling ruts. When the stagecoach finally rolled to a halt, Beatrice stepped down into a cloud of choking red dust. She looked up, expecting to see the sweeping veranda and the vast herds of cattle. Instead, her stomach plummeted into her boots. Before her stood a rotting, lopsided sod and timber cabin. The roof sagged under the weight of neglect, and the pasture was a barren expanse of cracked earth and dead sagebrush. There were no cattle. There was no grand estate. Amos tipped his hat, unloaded her steamer trunk into the dirt, and drove off without another word, eager to escape the desolate plot of land. Swallowing the lump of panic in her throat, Beatrice approached the crude wooden door and knocked. For a long moment, there was only the eerie howling of the prairie wind. Then, the door creaked open. Standing in the threshold was not a wealthy rancher. It was a boy of 14, his face streaked with weeks of grime, his eyes hollow and terrified. In his trembling hands, he leveled a rusted Winchester rifle directly at Beatrice's chest. "State your business and get off our land," the boy rasped, his voice cracking. Beatrice froze, her eyes drifting past the barrel of the gun to the darkness inside the cabin. Shadows moved in the gloom. Peering closer, she saw them. 6 more children. A girl of 12, clutching a butcher knife. A 10-year-old boy holding a piece of firewood like a club. Twin girls, no older than 7, huddled beneath a filthy blanket. A 5-year-old boy, staring with wide, haunted eyes. And in a wooden crate in the corner, a baby, barely a year old, wailing a weak, breathless cry of absolute starvation. "Where is Hiram Gallagher?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling but surprisingly steady. "I am Beatrice Colton. We are to be married." The 14-year-old lowered the rifle a fraction, a bitter, cynical laugh escaping his chapped lips. "You're the mail-order bride. Pa said you were coming. Where is he?" "Gone," the boy spat, his eyes hardening with a hatred no child should possess. "He packed his saddlebags a week ago, took the only good horse, the last of the salted meat, and whatever money he had left. Said he wasn't sticking around to be tied down by no fancy Eastern woman, and he was sick of listening to us cry for food. He ain't coming back. We're on our own." Beatrice stood paralyzed on the porch. The sheer magnitude of the deception crashed over her like a physical blow. Hiram Gallagher was a fraud, a coward, and a monster who had abandoned his own flesh and blood to die in the unforgiving Colorado winter, which was only a month away. She looked down at her gloved hands. She had a return ticket in her purse. She could walk back to Mercer's Crossing, board the eastbound train, and return to the miserable, yet safe, charity wards of Philadelphia. It was the logical choice. It was the safe choice. No one would blame her for fleeing this nightmare. But then, the baby in the corner let out another agonizing whimper. The 12-year-old girl looked at Beatrice, a single tear cutting a clean track down her dirt-caked cheek. They were feral, frightened, and utterly alone. Beatrice closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the harsh, arid air, and made the choice that would echo through the history of the western frontier. She reached up, unpinned her elegant feathered hat, and tossed it onto the dusty porch. She unbuttoned her fine silk gloves. "What is your name?" she asked the boy with the rifle. "Matthew," he said, wary. "Put the gun down, Matthew," Beatrice said, stepping past him into the squalid, foul-smelling cabin. "I am going to make us some supper." The first 2 weeks on the Gallagher homestead were a baptism by fire. Beatrice quickly realized that Hiram had left them with absolutely nothing. The well was nearly dry. The pantry contained only a handful of weevil-infested flour, and the cold winds of autumn were already beginning to bite through the chinks in the cabin's walls. The children, Matthew, Sarah, James, twins, Betsy and Cora, Samuel, and baby Nellie, treated her with a mixture of desperate awe and deep suspicion. They had been beaten down by a father who viewed them as burdens, and they fully expected this strange woman in her ruined Eastern dresses to abandon them just as he had. But Beatrice did not run. Instead, she fought. On the third day, she hitched the property's remaining, emaciated mule to a broken wagon and drove into Mercer's Crossing. She walked into the local mercantile, owned by a shrewd man named Phineas Reed, and opened her steamer trunk. Piece by piece, Beatrice sold her past to secure their future. She sold her silver hairbrushes, her grandmother's pearl brooch, her velvet winter cloaks, and finally, her white silk wedding dress. Phineas gave her a fraction of what they were worth, but it was enough. She loaded the wagon with sacks of beans, salted pork, flour, coffee, winter wool, and ammunition. When she returned to the cabin, the children watched in stunned silence as she began to cook a massive stew. That night, for the first time in months, the Gallagher children went to sleep with full bellies. But survival on the frontier required more than food. It required blood, sweat, and a hardening of the soul. Beatrice's soft hands blistered and bled from chopping firewood. Her skin browned and weathered under the relentless sun. She taught Matthew how to reinforce the cabin walls with fresh mud and straw. She taught Sarah how to sew warm winter coats from the rough wool she had purchased. Slowly, miraculously, the decaying cabin began to feel like a home. The children stopped looking at her like a stranger and started looking at her like a mother. However, Hiram Gallagher's sins were not limited to abandonment. He had left behind dangerous debts. On a cold Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into Beatrice's tenure, the thunder of hooves echoed across the dry earth. A posse of 5 heavily armed men rode into the yard, kicking up a storm of dust. At their head was Bartholomew Croft, a ruthless land baron who owned half the territory and controlled the rest through fear and violence. Croft, a heavy-set man with a silver-tipped cane and a predatory smile, didn't bother to dismount. He looked down at Beatrice, who was scrubbing clothes in a wooden tub, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. "Where's that coward Hiram?" Croft demanded, his voice booming over the wind. "He's gone," Beatrice said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He abandoned the property. I am Beatrice Colton. I manage this homestead now." Croft laughed, a cruel, jagged sound. A mail-order bride playing house. How quaint. "Well, Miss Colton, your runaway groom owed me $800. Since he ain't here to pay it, this land, the water rights, and everything on it belong to me. You and these brats have until sundown to pack your rags and walk off my property. If you're still here tomorrow morning, my men will burn this shack to the ground with you in it." The younger children began to cry, hiding behind Sarah. Matthew stepped forward, reaching for the Winchester, but Beatrice put a firm hand on the boy's chest, stopping him. She did not flinch. She did not cower. She picked up the heavy, rusted shotgun, leaning against the washtub, and leveled it at Croft's chest. "This land belongs to these children," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "You will not touch them. You will not touch this house. If any of your men step off their horses, I will blow you out of your saddle." Croft's smile vanished. His men reached for their revolvers. The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced with a knife. Beatrice knew she could only shoot one of them before the rest gunned her down, but she kept her eyes locked on Croft, utterly fearless. "You're making a fatal mistake, little lady," Croft sneered. "She ain't the only one you'll have to shoot, Croft." The deep, gravelly voice rolled out from the ridge just above the cabin. Everyone froze. Riding down the slope was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the unforgiving Colorado granite. He rode a massive black stallion, his duster coat billowing behind him like bat wings. A customized repeating rifle rested easily across his saddle horn. This was Cass Walton. Cass owned the sprawling ranch to the north. He was a solitary, dangerous man with a scarred cheek and a reputation for unparalleled violence when provoked. He had despised Hiram Gallagher. Hiram had once stolen cattle from Cass's herds, and Cass had sworn to kill him if he ever caught him. But as Cass rode his horse directly between Croft's men and Beatrice, his cold, steely gaze was fixed firmly on the land baron. "Walton," Croft growled, shifting nervously in his saddle. "This ain't your fight. Gallagher owed me." "Gallagher is gone," Cass said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "But I've been watching this woman for 3 weeks. She's worked her hands to the bone, keeping these kids alive while you sat in a saloon. You ain't taking this land, Bartholomew. You ride out now, or you don't ride out at all." Croft glared at Cass, weighing the odds. Cass Walton was known as the fastest draw in Mercer's Crossing, and the repeating rifle in his hand was no bluff. Sweating, Croft spat into the dirt. "This ain't over, Walton. I'll get my due." He yanked his horse's reins and galloped off, his men trailing quickly behind him. Silence descended on the yard. Beatrice slowly lowered the shotgun, her hands shaking violently now that the immediate danger had passed. Cass Walton holstered his rifle and tipped his Stetson. He looked at Beatrice, his dark, piercing eyes sweeping over her dirt-smudged face, her worn dress, and the fierce, protective way she stood in front of the 7 children. There was no pity in his gaze, only a profound, sudden respect. "You're a fool for standing up to Croft with a gun that hasn't been oiled in 5 years, Miss Colton," Cass said, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "I did what I had to do, Mr. Walton," Beatrice replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "And I don't need your charity." Cass chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "It ain't charity, ma'am. It's an investment. You've got more grit than any man in this territory. I'll send one of my hands over tomorrow with a slaughtered calf. Those kids look like they're made of twigs, and if you're going to survive the winter, you'll need the meat." Before she could argue, Cass wheeled his horse around. "Keep that shotgun handy, Boston. Croft will be back." As Cass rode away, Beatrice watched his broad shoulders fade into the distance. She didn't know it yet, but the arrival of the brooding, dangerous Cass Walton was the beginning of an alliance that would shake the very foundations of the territory and awaken a fiercely passionate love story born in the dust and blood of the Wild West. The winter of 1878 descended upon the Colorado Territory with a savage, unrelenting fury. By late November, the Gallagher homestead was buried beneath 3 feet of snow, the howling winds threatening to tear the reinforced sod roof right off the cabin walls. Yet, inside, a fragile warmth had taken root. Beatrice Colton had transformed the decaying shack into a fortress of survival. The scent of salted beef and baking bread replaced the stench of despair. The children, once hollow-eyed and feral, were filling out, their laughter occasionally piercing the heavy silence of the plains. True to his word, Cass Walton had not let them starve. Once a week, the imposing rancher rode through the snowdrifts on his massive black stallion, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. He brought venison, heavy woolen blankets, and split oak firewood. But he brought something else, too. A quiet, anchoring presence that the fatherless children desperately craved. Cass began teaching 14-year-old Matthew how to shoot a revolver properly. Correcting the boy's stance with a firm but patient hand, he showed 12-year-old Sarah how to cure meat so it wouldn't spoil in the spring. And in the quiet evenings, while the younger children slept huddled around the stone hearth, Cass would sit at the scarred wooden table with Beatrice, drinking bitter black coffee. It was during these hushed, firelit hours that Beatrice learned the truth about the dangerous, solitary man. Cass had not always been so hard. 5 years prior, a virulent outbreak of influenza had swept through the territory, claiming his young wife and their newborn son in a matter of days. Heartbroken and embittered, Cass had retreated from the world, building his cattle empire with ruthless efficiency and shutting away his heart. "I swore I'd never care for another soul in this God-forsaken territory," Cass murmured one evening, his dark eyes tracing the firelight dancing across Beatrice's hardened, beautiful face. "The frontier takes everything you love, Beatrice. It breaks you down to dust." "It only breaks you if you surrender, Cass," Beatrice replied softly, reaching across the table to lay her calloused hand over his rough, leather-gloved knuckles. "You didn't surrender. You just forgot what it felt like to fight for something other than yourself." Cass looked at her hand, a muscle feathering in his scarred jaw. The unspoken bond between them was undeniable, a fierce, slow-burning fire, forged in mutual respect and undeniable attraction. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, the air in the small cabin suddenly thick with anticipation. But the brutal frontier rarely allows for moments of peace. On a frigid morning in early January, the brief illusion of safety was shattered. The blizzard had temporarily broken, leaving the plains blindingly white under a pale winter sun. Beatrice was on the porch, shaking out a rug, when she saw a rider approaching through the deep snow. It was not Cass. The horse was lathered and exhausted, driven mercilessly by a man huddled in a filthy buffalo coat. As the rider drew closer, Matthew, who was chopping wood near the barn, dropped his axe. The blood drained from the boy's face. It was Hiram Gallagher. The runaway groom had returned. Hiram slid off his exhausted horse, his face heavily bearded, his eyes darting around the property with greedy, feverish calculation. He did not look at his children with love or remorse. He looked at the repaired cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney, and the stacked firewood with malicious satisfaction. "Well, well," Hiram sneered, marching up to the porch, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Looks like the mail-order bride actually showed up, and she made the place presentable." Beatrice stood her ground, blocking the doorway. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of cold fury. "You have no right to be here, Hiram. You abandoned these children to die." "This is my land," Hiram spat, taking a menacing step toward her. "I heard down in Denver that Bartholomew Croft is offering top dollar for these water rights, $1,000 in gold. I've come back to claim my property, sign the deed over to Croft, and collect my money." "And the children?" Beatrice demanded, her voice like cracking ice. Hiram laughed, a callous, empty sound. "Croft can do whatever he wants with them. Throw them in an orphanage, or let them freeze. I don't care. Now get out of my way, woman. I'm packing up. What's mine?" He lunged forward to shove Beatrice aside, but before his hands could touch her, Matthew stepped onto the porch. The 14-year-old boy was no longer the terrified child Hiram had left behind. Matthew held the heavy, oiled shotgun leveled directly at his father's stomach. "Take another step toward her, and I'll blow you in half," Matthew said, his voice dropping into an eerily calm register that sounded exactly like Cass Walton. Hiram froze, his eyes widening in shock. "You insolent whelp! Put that gun down! I'm your father!" "My father is dead," Matthew replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're just a thief trespassing on our land." Furious, outgunned, and humiliated, Hiram slowly backed down the porch steps. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Beatrice. "You think you've won, you Eastern witch? Croft is waiting for me in Mercer's Crossing. I'll be back by nightfall with his men. We'll see how brave this boy is when there's 10 guns pointed at his head." Hiram mounted his horse and spurred the beast back toward the trail, leaving a profound, terrifying silence in his wake. Beatrice pulled Matthew into a tight embrace, her mind racing. Hiram was a coward, but Bartholomew Croft was not. Croft wanted this land desperately, and with Hiram here to legally sign over the deed, Croft would have the excuse he needed to wipe them out completely. They were entirely out of time. The assault came just before dusk. The sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple, and fresh snow had begun to fall, thick and blinding. Beatrice had barricaded the heavy oak door and ordered the younger children to hide in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. She and Matthew knelt by the windows, rifles loaded, the cold seeping through the chinks in the logs. She had sent 10-year-old James slipping out the back window hours ago, bundled in white blankets to camouflage him against the snow, riding the mule toward Cass Walton's ranch. She only prayed the boy had made it through the drifts in time. Hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Through the frosted glass, Beatrice saw them. Bartholomew Croft, wrapped in an expensive fur coat, rode at the center of a dozen heavily armed men. Beside him rode Hiram Gallagher, clutching a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained the signed deed to the homestead. "Miss Colton," Croft's booming voice echoed over the roaring wind. "Hiram here has rightfully sold me this property. You are now trespassing. Come out with your hands up, or we will burn you out." "We aren't leaving," Beatrice shouted back through the cracked window. Croft sighed with exaggerated disappointment. He nodded to his men. "Burn it. Kill anyone who runs out." 3 men dismounted, carrying lit torches soaked in kerosene. They advanced toward the cabin. Beatrice took a steadying breath, aimed her rifle through the window slit, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle split the night. The lead thug screamed, dropping his torch into the snow as a bullet shattered his collarbone. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the wooden walls, shattering plates and sending splinters flying. Matthew fired back, his face pale but resolute. Beatrice pumped another shell into the chamber, firing blindly into the storm to keep the men at bay. But there were too many. A bullet grazed her shoulder, tearing through her woolen dress and drawing a sharp line of hot blood. "They're coming up the porch!" Matthew yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was a terrifying, rhythmic times, crack, crack, crack times, of a custom-repeating rifle. From the eastern ridge, descending like an angel of death through the driving snow, came Cass Walton. He wasn't alone. 6 of his toughest ranch hands rode beside him, including his foreman, Zeke. Cass's black stallion plowed through the snowdrifts, and Cass fired with lethal precision. Croft's men panicked. They were hired thugs, used to intimidating defenseless settlers, not fighting a hardened war party of seasoned cowboys. 2 of Croft's men fell from their saddles in the opening volley. The rest scrambled for cover, returning fire in a chaotic frenzy. Hiram Gallagher, realizing the battle was lost, spurred his horse in a desperate attempt to flee into the darkness, but Cass Walton cut him off. Cass drove his stallion directly into Hiram's horse, knocking the runaway groom into the deep snow. Hiram scrambled to his feet, pulling a revolver from his coat. But fear made his hands clumsy. Before Hiram could raise the barrel, Cass's repeating rifle fired a single, thunderous shot. Hiram fell backward into the snow, the stolen deed scattering from his satchel into the freezing wind. He did not move again. Seeing his men falling and his legal claim blowing away in the storm, Bartholomew Croft raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with terror. "Walton, wait! I surrender." Cass rode slowly up to Croft, his rifle aimed squarely at the land baron's chest. "You're done, Bartholomew. Put the guns down." As the gunfire ceased, the heavy cabin door creaked open. Beatrice stepped out onto the porch, clutching her bleeding shoulder, her face smudged with gunpowder and soot. Matthew stood beside her, lowering his weapon. The snow was stained crimson, the yard littered with the remnants of the brief, brutal skirmish. Through the darkness, another group of riders approached. It was Marshal Wade Henderson, accompanied by young James on his mule. Cass had sent a wire to the marshal's office in Denver weeks ago, compiling a thick dossier of evidence regarding Croft's illegal land seizures and extortion rings. Marshal Henderson surveyed the bloody scene, then looked at Croft. "Bartholomew Croft, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. Cuff him, boys." As the deputies hauled the protesting land baron away, Cass dismounted and walked through the snow toward the porch. He ignored the carnage around them, his eyes locked entirely on Beatrice. When he saw the blood seeping through her sleeve, his hardened expression cracked with raw, unbridled panic. "You're hit," Cass said, taking the porch stairs 2 at a time. "It's just a graze," Beatrice whispered, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her trembling. Cass didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his heavy duster coat. It was the embrace of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. Beatrice buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of gunpowder, leather, and winter pine. "I told you Croft would be back," Cass murmured into her hair. "And I told you I didn't need your charity," Beatrice replied, a tired, genuine smile touching her lips. Cass pulled back, cupping her dirt-stained face in his large, calloused hands. "It ain't charity, Beatrice. I'm asking you to merge these ranches. I'm asking you to let me adopt these kids legally, so no one can ever touch them again." He paused, his dark eyes fiercely tender. "And I'm asking you to marry me. Not by mail, by choice." Tears, hot and fast, spilled over Beatrice's cheeks. She looked at Matthew, who gave a small, approving nod, and then back at the man who had fought through a blizzard to save them. "Yes," she whispered into the freezing night. "Yes." The marriage of Beatrice Colton and Cass Walton united the two largest tracts of land in the territory, creating a sprawling, impenetrable empire. They legally adopted all 7 of Hiram's abandoned children, raising them with the iron discipline of the West and the refined grace of the East. Matthew would grow up to become one of the most respected lawmen in Colorado, while Sarah took over the mercantile in Mercer's Crossing. Beatrice, the mail-order bride who refused to run, lived to be 92, surrounded by dozens of grandchildren. Her story remains a testament to the fact that the West wasn't just tamed by the gun, it was forged by the unbreakable spirit of a mother's love. Did Beatrice's incredible courage and Cass's fierce loyalty capture your heart? This true tale of frontier survival proves that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people you fight for. If you love this Wild West romance and want more thrilling real-life historical dramas, hit that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story.